day to viewers, the Colonel speaking to you live from the Preceptory for British Imperial YouTube Broadcasting. And we're on to, I think, part 5 of the Squire Rambles on. Good day to you, Squire. How are things?
Very well, thank you, Colonel. How are you?
Very well, thanks. And perhaps you'd care to tell us of some of the characters you met early in life. Were there any characters when you were at school?
Well, I started school in 1955 at a local primary school, which was just about half a mile away from where we lived at the farm. I was there till 1961, when I'd just taken my 11 plus and failed it, and went to the local secondary. It was a secondary modern school in those days. Of course, nowadays schools are comprehensives. And I remember that I started school, and I remember it was quite a reasonably bad winter when I started school. So I remember being taken by my mother, walking down to school in the snow, and we had started off in the infants class, and I remember this room quite vividly because it had a coal fire in it, if I remember rightly.
Good Lord.
And had a climbing frame at one end, and then there was a storage cupboard where they had a big wooden train.
Right.
I think it was painted wood and black, a great wooden train that everybody sort of queued up to play on. And of course, in those days, lessons were fairly basic. Bit of singing. A teacher used to read us stories by the fire. I remember it had a tiled section of wall which had like nursery scenes of tiles in it. I remember the climbing frame at the end. And the thing was, it was a school that was built just before the Second World War. I think it was finished I think it opened about 1938. And in the design of it, I think it was envisaged that it could be used as a hospital if war came, because the design of it was such there seemed to be one long corridor with rooms leading off, which were the classrooms, which could have been used as wards. And I remember it was quite a light and airy building. They had large French doors and windows, big windows leading onto the playing field. Had quite a big playing field, I don't know, 2 or 3 acres I expect. It was a large field, which amazingly enough now is about 20 odd years ago they built on it, most of it, and now it's believe it or not, by a school. They put old people's bungalows. And in the days when I was there, we used to be a sports field and general area to play in, so we had plenty of room to get out. Occasionally we used to be invaded by the neighbouring farmers' sheep, and I remember we did the sort of sheep rounding up detail wasn't unusual. And the headmaster was a real character called Mr. Busby.
Right.
I think everybody listening who was at school will never forget Mr. Busby. Great big man. He used to play, I think he was a keen cricketer. And he knew my father quite well. And so he was the headmaster down there. And then the deputy headmaster was a man called Mr. Gleghorn, who was a very, very nice gentleman. He'd been in the war, he'd been in the Air Force, and was interested in radio. And of course, as soon as I started showing a bit of interest in radio, we had sort of quite interesting, even as a child, had interesting talks about how he used to ask him questions about various. Could he identify this radio valve for me, or whatever? He was very willing to do that.
Wonderful.
And that was the head and the deputy head. And as we sort of progressed through the school, went through the infants and various other sort of characters we had up there, and then went into the upper school. And in those days, in a lot of the classes, the teachers used to teach 2 forms at the same time.
Right.
There was the A stream and the B stream, and you had, as I remember it, you had one teacher used to teach 1B and 2B, and then another teacher used to teach 3B and 4B.
Right.
And so you were in the same classroom, but when the year changed, you just had another group come up and one move on. So you had the same class teacher for 2 years.
Right.
It's not like it is today with a lot of teachers teaching different subjects. Most teachers in the primary school, a teacher taught most of the subjects.
Right.
Arithmetic and English, craft, and singing. We used to have a teacher that used to take singing. And yes, I was there till 1961, and then, as I say, I moved up to the secondary school, and that's when you sort of went from the small school into the big school with a whacking grey corridor down the middle. And it was all fairly disciplined in those days. I mean, you didn't sort of slummock along the corridors. You were ordered to keep to the left-hand side in single file, and the prefects were lined up down the middle to make sure that you did. Otherwise, there was trouble. And I think one of the sort of notable teachers I remember up there were science teachers. They were some real characters.
Science teachers do tend to be completely nuts, in my experience.
Well,
too.
there was one who tried to gas himself. He actually tried to gas himself. I think he put his head in the. I think he tried to gas himself, and used to chuck people's books out of the window if he lost his temper, and they were sent down to retrieve them.
Dear, oh
and
dear.
The other science master, I don't know. Do you remember? I don't know if any of the listeners remember a chap who used to be on the television called Dr. Magnus Pike.
Oh yes.
Now, you remember what he was like, very enthusiastic and arms flying in all directions. Well, another science teacher we had there was like him. Very enthusiastic. He'd had quite a bad injury and used to walk with a limp. And he had many an incident at school. In fact, there was one I remember where he had this experiment where it was to show that you actually saw he set off this. He was going to set off this flash, and what he did was he sent some children to a nearby hill to watch the science room on the end of the building, and he had this sort of military semi-explosive device that he set off.
Right. And
the idea was to time the distance between seeing the flash and the sound travelling to you.
I see.
Well, the only problem was it was a bit overpowered, and it blew the wall off the end of the science room or something like that. It was a hell of an explosion and an awful lot of fuss and bother.
Yes.
And then there was quite an elderly teacher who used to teach gardening.
Teach gardening?
Oh yes, we used to have gardening, you see, up there. And see, the thing was that the secondary school in those days, it was taking the boys who didn't pass the 11 plus, who weren't going to go on to an academic education, and to teach them, get them grounded in some kind of a trade that they would go into. I mean, they had classes there. There was building, practical building. There was what they called technical rural. There was rural studies, which I went into because I was destined to go into farming. I mean, it was in those days, if you had a chance like that, nobody ever thought that you would do anything differently. It was completely unthinkable for me to think of doing something else. You've got the farm boy. That's what you're going to do. It was none of this whiffling and waffling that goes on today. And anyway, we had this chap who we had a big shed. We used to have one classroom, you see. It was like a garden potting shed where we had all the used to go in there, and there was a greenhouse at one end. I remember the other end they used to keep the tools. They used to have a sort of motor tractor. They used to horticultural things with a plough on. They used to do gardening with, and the classes all had plots. We used to look after our own garden plot, and then we had another teacher that used to do rural science, and we used to keep chickens. They used to keep chickens down there.
Amazing.
And I don't know if I've told you this story. I may have done. I hope I haven't. I'm not repeating myself, but I know they had a famous occasion where they had these chickens, and they put the cockerel in with the hens. It took one look at them and dropped dead.
Oh dear.
Because the teacher couldn't believe it. He just picked it up. He said it's just died. So I can't remember what happened to it after that. I expect it
probably ended up on the menu, I should imagine.
Somewhere, yes, indeed. Yeah. and the gardening teacher was quite frail. I think he had sort of an early form. He might have had Parkinson's in the early stages. He was quite shaky, and he was deaf and used to wear a hearing aid. And I know some of these rotten little so-and-sos used to drop their voices, and he kept turning his hearing aid up and then speak loudly and nearly deafening the poor
Oh
chap,
dear, that's a bit cruel, but
he used to do them.
boys will be boys.
Yes, but he was always quite interesting. I used to be rather good during those rural studies lessons. Used to get us outside in the air. And then we had a lady science teacher, and she was quite a large woman, and she used to have this habit of so we used to have these benches round the science room, and she used to sort of jump up and sit on the bench.
Oh.
Well, one day the bench gave way and she went through it. And one of the other teachers said she crushed the conical flasks to dust, if I remember.
Oh dear, oh dear.
Oh golly, yes. And then there was a man who taught music. He was a very, very nice person. I used to get on well with him because I was always into music, and we had long talks about various music and things. And through many diverse ways, I actually did lessons on the viola.
Right.
I was given some violins when I was in about second year, and I took one of them to school, and the teacher looked at it and said, "Well, that's a bit small for you." He said, "What do you think about trying the viola?" So I tried that. I did lessons. I was never all that brilliant on it, but I got to the stage where I used to go to after I left school. I used to, because people got to know that I used to play a bit, and I used to be invited to a music group, and I went to a music group in a local man's house, and we played music for about 10 years like that.
Good Lord.
Used to go once a week for music, and used to play simple pieces, mostly school orchestra stuff. And most of the people came who to me were getting on a bit, and they learned a long time ago. But we used to enjoy ourselves. It used to be something different. And then at the secondary school, after I'd left, they had a music school, Saturday morning music school, where they actually had an orchestra, a school orchestra, and I was considered to be an adult in those days, so we were asked to. They had several adults that used to play along with them. We used to sit in the orchestra. I used to sort of play in the viola section. They had 2 or 3 other children playing as well, and then there were the sort of first violins and second violins, and that used to be fun because the conductor was quite well known. Have you heard of Muir Matheson?
Oh yes, he wrote a lot of the film scores for the Ealing comedies and things.
That's right. Well,
or conducted them anyway.
That's right. Well, Muir Matheson had a brother called John, and he was a Scotsman, and he was very much like, if you can imagine, can you remember James Robertson Justice as Sir Lancelot Spratt? Well, he was very like him. The attitude was very similar, but it was good. And I actually played with that orchestra. I actually played in 2, maybe 3 concerts for the parents.
Amazing.
Which gave me an insight as to what it was like to actually play in an orchestra. And the thing is that people listen to an orchestra, and what we mustn't forget is that if you're playing in the orchestra, you hear the instruments that are just round you, and you can't really hear what's going on the other side. That's why you need a conductor to keep the orchestra together. I mean, he's not just waving his arms about, he's beating time and bringing sections of the orchestra in when they should be, because a small group, a group of chamber musicians, would play without a conductor, but when it gets a bit bigger, you do need a conductor. Some orchestras don't need a conductor, but they are really, really top notch if it's like that. But it gave me a bit of experience in music. I've still got the viola. I wouldn't dare play it. I mean, please, nobody asked me to give you a recital on that, as everybody would switch off within 2 seconds, because I'm totally out of practice. But I still have the instrument at home. That was the music, and then we had the various other subjects. The one that I think the thing that most people all hated was the games, the PE. That was awful.
Oh, yes.
The chap who used to do that had been, I think he'd been something like an ex-forces PT instructor.
Oh dear.
And he was a real so-and-so. I think legendary character. I mean, if somebody wanted a boot, if needed a boot in the right place, they used to get it. Physically, you know,
Oh dear.
whacking great kick, and all sorts of things went on with him.
Yes.
And in fact, to tell a story, he was actually carrying on an affair with the girl's PE instructor in his changing room during the lessons.
Oh dear.
And that was going on for years.
Dear,
Everybody knew about it. I think that nobody did anything. But that was going on for ages. He was a Welshman, and used to be a keen rugby man, and used to. In fact, he had an expression. I always play on the winning side.
Oh.
So if it was two classes playing, if one class was losing, he always used to switch sides and play for the other side. The thing is, up there though, it was I disliked. I think a lot of people hated PE up there, because if people didn't know it, they weren't taught it. They'd expect you to go into school knowing how to play football, because you weren't really taught much about it. You were just put out on the field and hope for the best, really.
Yes.
But no, there are many stories regarding that school. I left when I was 15 and started work on the farm. Mind you, being the fact that I'd born and brought up on the farm, I was working, you know, in the holidays and weekends. I was out doing my bit on the land.
Yes,
because
of course.
we all had our tasks to do, no matter how old we were on that. So that was really basically the school days.
Yeah.
I didn't get any qualifications at school, though not that it worried me all that much. I managed to occupy myself quite well, managed to get myself some kind of a job. So then that day finished, and that's when I started work on the farm.
And, didn't one of the masters bring in a trademark machine for you to look at or something?
Oh yes, that was that science master who I was telling you about, the very enthusiastic one who blew the end off. He had another experiment that was good. We used to deal with, of course, mechanical things and a car engine, and they dealt with the sort of Otto four-stroke cycle of running where a four-stroke engine runs. And to demonstrate the power stroke, he had this experiment where he used to fill a tin with coal gas and put a lid on the end which had a plug in it, a spark plug, and then he used to crank this magneto and pop the end off. And he used to go up with a loud bang and blow the end off, you see. Well, that wasn't quite good enough for him, and I seem to remember he got a 5-gallon oil drum and tried it and nearly had another major accident. There was always a hell of a bang and everything blew in all directions.
Yes.
It was always a bit of experience with him, but he certainly used to. His store cupboard was full of all sorts of junk and bits and pieces, all sorts of gear in there, and it used to be quite fascinating actually. We used to have a scientific society, and we used to go once a week to the scientific society where we tried various experiments and making things. But now how we got through school unscathed sometimes, I don't know.
Well, it does sound a bit odd. I must admit, science masters always struck me as being odd. One at my school couldn't even spell his own name, and it was only 4 letters long. But it amazes me that so this chap brought in a sort of trademark machine to play.
Well, funnily enough, when I'd left school in 1965, the next thing I heard, a friend of mine stayed on, and he left and went back to school and worked with this science as a laboratory technician. And he told me, well, he said they're going to have an exhibition of gramophones and sound. So then they had to try and collect anything together on gramophones and sound, and they knew that I'd got things, so I lent my gramophones, and the science master brought in that he'd got, and it was a Berliner.
Right.
I think it was his father's or his grandfather's, and it was a Berliner gramophone, genuine Berliner. So whatever happened to that, I don't know.
Amazing. And he played it for you?
No, he couldn't. No, I think the sound box was missing, but it was basically complete. A nice, wonderful old machine. And I think it was then where on that exhibition he went round everybody he knew and people he didn't know trying to get hold of gramophones. And I think we had they put a display on exhibition of about probably 50 odd gramophones and phonographs. I had a photograph of it somewhere, but and that was 1965. And they had the newspaper up to the local newspaper up, and one of the people there saw that a lot of my name on some of the things, and the upshot of that was I had that first interview in the Whitney Gazette I think it was the Whitney Gazette or the Oxford Times from that, where they came to interview me at the farm.
So that's 50 years ago now.
It is 50 years ago. I just don't know where the time's gone. It's frightening, really.
Extraordinary. And I seem to recall you telling me you kept your collection in a barn at that time, or was that slightly later?
That was slightly later. That's after we sold the farm. When I had the farm, we had one of our memory trips. I'll draw some sketches of the farmhouse, and we'll have a little verbal tour through the farmhouse. Because it starts quite basically, then it gets to quite a mystery at the end of it, which was never solved.
No.
I'll leave that as a taster of what's to come regarding that.
How interesting.
But I had a room in the house where I used to keep the gramophones and records. And I suppose when I was at secondary school, I'd probably got 3,000 or 4,000 78s then.
Amazing.
Because people were still passing them on, and I used to buy a few lots occasionally. So yes, I used to have a lot of things, and I probably when I just left school, I'd probably got about 4 or 5 gramophones. And then I bought it. I didn't do much then until I left school and managed to get a bit more money. Then I used to go and buy a few bits and pieces at a local sale.
I was going to say, were there sort of jumble sales about and that sort of thing?
Well, there were. There was an auction sale in Whitney called the Church House Sale, which was a general furniture sale. I used to buy records and gramophones from that. And I think it's when we used to go, you could go down with a couple of pounds and come back with a couple of gramophones with boxes of 78s and books as well thrown in for good measure.
Yes, I must admit in my early days the cheapest thing in auctions was usually 78s and books.
Yes, there used to be quite a lot of them.
And you'd get quite a lot for your money.
Oh, very much so, yes, indeed.
In the days before sort of buyer's premium and all that sort of nonsense.
Oh, yes. Well, this was a sale where people used to put their odd bits and pieces in. There were usually a few old radios, 1 or 2 gramophones. It used to be a treat, really, when I was on the farm in the 60s to go down and have a look. As I say, go down with a couple of pounds and try and buy something. And that's where I learnt the ropes on how to bid and how to, under the supervision of my father, how to bid and what to do and what not to do.
Yes. Didn't you used to go to farm sales as well? And,
oh yes, yes indeed, yes.
There are, people can watch Lovejoy and the sort of antics he gets up to at farm sales, but it happened for real.
It's not Lovejoy. There's a lot in Lovejoy that's very true to life, particularly at that time. Yes, indeed. Golly, yes, and the auctioneers. Well, there are some real characters, the auctioneers.
Well, auctioneers don't seem to have changed an awful lot. They seem to think themselves very grand these days, but I remember auctioneers at the time, they were just sort of either country bumpkins or sort of failed comedians. They were always trying to make jokes and other stupid things.
I know,
and
that's right.
It used to be very, if they didn't want, if they wanted to knock an item down to their friends, they jolly well did.
And if they wanted to run you, they'd pull one off the wall all the time.
Oh, they would. That hasn't changed.
They'll run you all right. You've got to watch that. You have to make sure that somebody is actually bidding against you, and somebody not sort of saying yes, yeah, and bouncing them off the wall. You have to watch that one. You have to be on the ball with an auction to be quite honest.
Didn't your father always say stand next to the item after you bought it, otherwise it might vanish?
Well, yes, or get somebody to. That was always my job. If he bought some bits and pieces, you stand there and keep an eye on it. Boy, I'll go and pay for it, and then we'll get loaded up in the car. Because otherwise, you never knew what. Some things would suddenly disappear, and they wouldn't be there when you came back. Otherwise,
it's strange. I went to a very old-fashioned auction many years ago where, if they hadn't, because it was a one vendor sale, if an item didn't sell, they amalgamated it with the next lot, and I hadn't realised that. And when I bought quite a few lots, and when I went to pay, my bill looked like the Andrex puppy's sort of toilet roll coming out. It was extraordinary. I bought about 300 lots. I only bid for about 30.
Yes, well, that sort of thing did happen, but the farm sales were good fun. I don't know. They don't have farm sales today like they used to in those days. In those days, the local paper used to have lots of adverts for them, particularly about this time of year, Septemberish time. We used to get lots of farm sales, and people used to go there buying old implements and livestock. Of course, a lot of cattle sales.
And of course it would be sort of the contents of the barns, and
absolutely
the attics of the house would be cleared out, and all sorts of stuff would appear, I imagine.
I'll never forget once I was at one sale and there was a magnificent mahogany dining table. I think it had 8 or 10 leaves in it, so you can imagine how big, and the leaves were about 3 feet, so you can imagine how long it was. Solid mahogany. They couldn't get £5 for it.
No.
Things fetched next to nothing in those days.
Seems to be getting that way with a lot of auctions of traditional furniture these days.
Well, this was back in the 60s where the nostalgia boom hadn't started, and that sort of stuff wasn't worth the money.
No internet and no sort of way of selling other than sort of face to face, really.
Absolutely.
I suppose that's why there's so many odd people in the business.
Well, yes, indeed, very much so.
Oh dear.
So then, when I left school, it was on the farm for 7.5 years then.
Goodness me.
And yes, the day used to start at about 5 o'clock in the morning, get the cows in, milk them, and then of course they had to cool the milk, and then that was put out on the churn stand at the front, by the front gate for the milk lorry to come and pick up. It was all milk churns in those days. And so you see these milk churns in antique centres. I used to use the wretched things.
They were a working piece of equipment, not some sort of decorative or
gosh no,
what have you, polished up and that.
Oh no. And a lot of these things, you see these buckets we used to have. You've seen them with a bucket of, I suppose, about 18 inches high, tapering at the top, with like a machined ring at the top, with a handle. Well, they often put these in antique centres as Victorian milk churns. Well,
yes.
They're not actually. What they are is buckets from the bucket milking plants we used to have into the 50s. Where you had they were sort of worked on a vacuum system, where you had a lid that fitted on there, and the equipment to milk the cows.
We saw one the other day, didn't we?
We did indeed, yes. Yes, that's right.
Extraordinary.
Yes, golly, yes.
Well, a lot of old nonsense is put on tickets in antique centres. Not just the price either.
Oh, I know. Well, there was Victorian milk churns. I think to myself, no, it isn't. I've used one of those only about 50 years ago.
Well, they polish off the chrome or nickel plating, and they go down to the copper.
That's right.
And they think it's Victorian.
Which you couldn't have done, because it would have had to have been tinned.
Well, exactly, tinned, of course.
Tinned, of course, to have tainted the milk.
Yes.
That's people don't realise about milk, is how easily milk is tainted. You see, if you've got cows, you've got to be careful. There's one thing you've got to be careful of in a field sometimes, and that is if there are any wild onions.
Ah.
Now, funnily enough, I remember there used to be wild onions. Well, if a cow eats wild onions, then you'll get oniony tasting milk.
Yes.
And so you had to be careful what they ate.
Well, it does only apply to cows. I remember a girlfriend of mine who had a baby, and she had grapefruit. She had grapefruit juice, and it went through, and the baby was crying like mad. And when she went to the doctor, the sharp taste had got through to the milk. Well, I don't know why I'm telling you that,
I mean, it's basic, really. What goes in must come out.
Yes.
And I remember Father really carrying on when I dropped a bag of peppermints in the manger of a cow. He said, "Get those things out of there quickly, so you'll have a problem with that."
Well, yeah, taste in the milk.
Absolutely.
Yes.
It's things one doesn't really, dame milk normally comes in bottles or plastic containers, and people don't realise what it's like to do it.
Dear.
Particularly in those days when it was all, although it was partly mechanised, we did have milking machines, but the cows still went into cow sheds and were tied up and fed while they were milked, and then they were turned out and another lot brought in to be milked, and we had these buckets. And what we had, you see, were these 3 buildings. There was a cowshed with standing for 4 cows at the top, and then I think we had one cowshed with a standing for 6 cows, and another cowshed with a standing for 7 cows. We used to get the cows in and then tie them up and get them feeding, and then we used to milk them, and then they used to go out in the yard and we used to get the next shift in to milk like that.
Because nowadays I hear on the Archers, they all have milking parlours, don't they?
Well, that was actually coming in, milking parlours and milking bales they used to call them. That was coming in at that time, and we were getting very old-fashioned by the time we packed up in the 70s, and getting to be well obsolete the way we used to do it. But basically we had this bucket with this attachment on the top, and in the cowsheds we had a vacuum, a pipeline about 1-inch thick pipe running all the way through the cowsheds with taps and that was a vacuum line. And in a shed we had a pump driven by an electric motor.
Right.
Or in the case of breakdown, an old Petter air-cooled engine, if you could get the damn thing to start. And we used to milk the cows like that. So we milked the cow, tip the bucket in, take the bucket down to the dairy, and then tip it in the cooler. And that used to cool the milk, and then in the churns ready for the lorry to pick up.
Well, people forget it's an awful lot of hard work and manual work in farming in those days.
Oh yes, it certainly was. I mean, then after you finished milking the cows, you had to clean the cow sheds out, to go and check the young cattle. You had to go and see the cattle 2 or 3 times a day. All sort of things you had to look out for. Anything getting injured, anything, and there were various. I mean, in the spring and summer, you had to be careful of a thing called magnesium deficiency, which called grass staggers. Used to stagger about, get magnesium. So to help keep that at bay, we had these salt licks. If you can imagine a thing a bit like about the size of a brick, which were salt and vitamins, we used to have those in the mangers, and the cow used to lick them and used to take in the vitamins to try and keep that at bay.
Right.
There was a nasty thing called blackleg they used to get. We had to inject them for. We used to have to inject them for various things to try and keep various
all sorts of
diseases.
strange diseases nowadays, which didn't seem to be current in those days.
Well, they keep on about this, what do they call it now? Mad cow disease. I'm sure half of that is what we used to call grass staggers years ago.
Right.
Because we used to get this. There may be another cause for it. We used to certainly get this grass staggers where they used to have to get the vet in, they used to sort them out. Then, of course, there was the question of delivering calves and all this. Cow calving. You know,
the sort of thing seen on James Herriot films, as I recall.
Well, I've done that for real, I promise you, more than once.
Getting the rope round their necks and legs and that and pulling them out.
Oh, absolutely. You had to do that, and you had to do more than that sometimes. You know, if the calf was going to come easily, you had to be in what they used to call the diving position, where you had the front legs coming straight out and the head along the legs. Well, sometimes you get an instance where you used to get a leg back and didn't come forward, so you had to try and push the calf back inside the cow, straighten the leg out, and then it would come. And if the head was back, we had to do the same thing. And sometimes they were twisted. You had all sorts of problems. And so yes, that was quite a game. So if a cow was due to calve, you had to keep an eye on it, because you could usually tell, because it'd be in the corner of field away from the others. Oh, that cow's going to calve soon. You know, you had to keep an eye on it. And with any luck, you looked out the next time, and there was a live calf up there.
Good Lord.
And the funny thing, you got a heifer calf that was female, and the bull calf, of course, that was male. And you could usually tell the sex of the calf by what was happening. If you saw the calf and it was lying down, you could think, bull calf. If it was up running about, heifer calf. And 9 times out of 10 you were right. It was really funny. And you get a knack for things like that. I mean, I expect I've lost it now. I don't suppose I'd be much good on the land these days. The way we used to farm, you'd find in museums nowadays.
Dear, oh dear. Funny you should say that about cows. My mother used to say that about girls. If they were low slung, it's a boy. If they were sort of projecting, it was a girl. And you know, she was right.
Really?
With various
really?
I should stress ex-girlfriends of mine at the time. But yes, extraordinary, really.
Yes.
But you know, but by the sound of it, you know, it was nice to look back on. But you probably wouldn't want to go back to it today.
No, I don't think so. I had nightmares about farming for years. After I packed up, I used to get nightmares about things that happened.
Dear, oh dear.
Yes, oh golly, yes. A lot of nasty things happened that I wouldn't want to talk about.
No, this is it. People forget that, it's not all sort of
no,
sunny days and sitting having your sandwiches in the hay ricks or what have you.
No, so struggling in cold, frosty, dirty conditions.
Well, that's it. And trying to start the tractor at 5 o'clock in the morning.
All sorts of fun and games, yes, that's right.
Oh dear, with frost on the ground or snow or what have you.
Oh golly, yes. Because if the weather got bad, then you had problems then, because you had to try and keep the cattle indoors, and if you couldn't, or like milking cows indoors, then of course it was a lot more work because you had a lot more cleaning to do and a lot more feeding. Yes, it got quite fraught at times.
And there wasn't a huge amount of money in it. That's the point.
No, it was a question of survival really, and it got to the state that we couldn't really survive any longer. So that's when we packed up.
Well, that's it.
It just got. I would have liked to have carried on with it. I'd like to have given it, say, another 2 or 3 more years, because we did have 1 or 2 bad patches, which we were just starting to get out of, and I thought, well, we might be able to do some. Give me 2 or 3 more years, but then my father died, and then various events happened that we sold the farmer.
Yes. Mind you, if you hadn't, I'm fairly certain you wouldn't be here now.
Yes, it might be problematic because my father didn't make it to retirement. He died at 64.
Dear, oh dear.
But mind you, had 2 or 3 quite serious illnesses, so not surprising in a way.
But he was well known for his sayings, wasn't he? And,
yes, too true. Yes, my word, yes.
But I suppose you had to be fairly philosophical being a farmer in those days.
Absolutely.
Because you were on your own.
Absolutely, yes, that's it.
It was sink or swim, and you just had to make the best of what you got.
Very much so, yes, indeed.
If you got a patch of good land and some bad, you had to just make the best of it, or...
Well, it was like a field we had. It was a 32-acre field, quite a big one, and you could divide the field into 3 parts. You had the piece just inside the gateway that was heavy land and had to be handled one way. Then you had quite a big section in the middle which was quite good, and then 6 acres at the top that was totally different again. So you went from sort of heavy clay soil, which was difficult to work, to a light stony brashy soil which you had to handle. So we had to cultivate that field basically in three different ways.
I don't think people realise that. They look at a green field and think it is just a field, but it is actually a natural place, and will vary. The land is different in different places. There are different types of soils and grades of soils.
Oh, very much so. And through the middle of where I used to live in Hayley near Whitney, there was a band of clay about 100 yards each side of the road.
Good Lord.
And you would tell it was heavy, and then it suddenly lightened up when you got past that.
Sounds like there was a river there in prehistoric times or something.
I don't know, but it certainly had to be handled. You had to have different techniques in handling it.
Extraordinary. And that, of course, is not something you can learn from a book. You've just got to learn from doing it.
Well, that's right, really. It's experience, and you've got to listen to the people who know the land, really.
That's it, knowing the land. That's a phrase.
Absolutely, too true.
Heard quite a lot.
Yes, indeed.
Dear, oh dear.
Yes, long time ago now.
Well, as we say, 50 years ago, you were in the paper there.
Yes, that's right. I had several. I kept the gramophones were the sort of hobby that kept me going when I was farming. I used to go out doing the farming, and then used to do the gramophones when I got time. And used to give me something else to do, because I didn't get out a lot. You see, it's not like most of the people I was at school with. A lot of the people I was in my class obviously got other jobs, and I lost touch with a lot of them. And I see people come up to me now and say, I was at school with you. I said, well, I'm sorry, I can't remember. Obviously I've changed less than they have, but it was just the case that I was stuck on the farm 18 hours a day and they were out doing other things.
Well, this is it. People forget the farming is a very isolated profession.
it was, particularly in those days. It still is today in a way, because if you're doing field work, you're out on a tractor all day long or something like that.
Well, most people only left the farm for the county show and maybe the weekly market.
Well, that's very true, yes.